Yeah, so I'm Irish, and I spent I'm adopted New Zealander, and in New Zealand the indigenous people have a very nice practice where they introduce themselves and their ancestors. So I'd like to um, acknowledge all my family and my wife and my parents who paid for my education, and all my research group who contributed to what I know today and helped me with my publications. And the people of India who have invited me to this talk. Thank you very much. In Maori, we would say, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto. You repeat it to emphasize it. So yeah, my main research is looking at biogeography from the biodiversity informatics, but I also have a long interest in marine reserves, and I was teaching a course on marine protected areas for 16 years in New Zealand. And a lot of these same issues come up, some of which my friend Bill Ballantyne called invented problems. So we scientists are very good at finding real problems, but also sometimes we invent problems and make things more difficult. So I hope you'll see some of these in the lecture. I'll share my slides now. So the photograph there is by a former newspaper editor, actually, who was a fisherman, and one day he went to the beach and he saw there was a sign, "No fishing, marine reserve." This is at Lee Marine Laboratory. And he thought, this is a very strange idea. Why would you want a marine reserve? And when he saw what happened in the marine reserve, he became so passionate about the ocean because so many fish recovered that he went and actually visited many and wrote a book on it and became an underwater photographer. So I think what Bill and I used to say sometimes is that we were lucky in New Zealand that the first marine reserve was easy for the public to access. And when people went there and they saw the abundance of fish and life, they realized what it should be like, or used to be like, everywhere. And we used to joke that it's a bit like chocolates. When you have one marine reserve and you experience it, you want to go and have more. So in this talk, I'll briefly introduce about the state of modern fisheries and fishery management and how it compares with what we do on land, and how marine reserves, I suggest, are the only practical solution left to improve fishery management. As most of us are probably aware, we have industrialized the land for thousands, hundreds and thousands of years. And we're doing the same in the oceans now in the last century. So if we think forward into what the pace of technology, we could have major effects on the oceans, but probably the main effect still is fishing. And the oceans, we're lucky that the oceans have relatively few species that have gone extinct compared to what has happened on land. But it's only a matter of time. If we continue the way we continued in the past, then the oceans are just the next frontier that's going to be devastated, and it'll be a loss for our future generations. And the governments are responding. So to be fair, we've had many international agreements which have been successful, not just the ozone layer, but in controlling hunting of large whales just before they went extinct, and they're now recovering. We've been reducing toxic pollutants. There's all sorts of agreements to protect migratory birds and mammals. We stopped testing nuclear bombs in the Pacific Ocean, thank goodness. And so there is a response from governments, but maybe they wait until the situation gets too bad before they respond. And this little photograph I have in the corner here is the community in northern New Zealand, where the schools campaigned for nearly 10 years to have marine reserves in their local bay. They're successful in getting 2 out of 3 marine reserves established, but they still felt that people weren't respecting them enough. So they formed a line. There's a YouTube video showing this right around the coast of the marine reserve, where they performed, a Mexican wave along it, and they had helicopters in the sky and boats at sea. So you can imagine the emotional impact of this to the community, so that nobody would disrespect the reserve after seeing this display, because they know that the people want it and value it. So we have a convention on biological diversity. Many countries have signed up to it, but most have not achieved the aims of what they've not fulfilled their promises. We also have a convention on the law of the sea, which is even earlier, goes back to 1982. And in that, countries promise to be responsible and use the ocean sustainably. So they have used the oceans very well, but they haven't addressed the sustainability issue. And sustainability means controlling fishing. And within the convention, the HE target, which is now going to be, I see, being called a Cumning target, which will be 30% of the ocean in MPAs by 2030. And following what the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, called for in 2016. So countries are now signing up to agreements to protect 30% of the oceans and the land globally. But it seems to be very flexible as to what countries regard as protection, because sometimes they call areas protected areas where nothing is protected, and then sometimes they do protect places, but they don't call them protected areas. So it's a rather confusing. So what's the progress? This graph is a couple of years old, but I took it from the World Database on Protected Areas, which is a database that governments enter information the places that they call protected. These are not validated independently, so we just have to trust the governments do the right thing. And we can see a big increase in protected areas, over 9,000. I think now it's maybe even over 10,000 marine protected areas in the world. So this sounds fantastic. But actually, if we did a size graph, most of them are only a few kilometers squared. They're very small. People could swim across them in a little while. But most of these allow fishing, over 90%. Only 6% aim to protect nature. And this 6% only counts for 2.5, I think maybe 2.6% of the ocean now. There's an online database called MPA Atlas, which provides the most accurate figures. And 3/4 of coastal countries don't have even one marine reserve. So they really haven't even tried to see what a natural marine ecosystem looks like. They have no idea, because we've been fishing for hundreds of years and in coastal areas. So we really don't know what natural is. We've no reference, no control in most places of the world. And in fact, some of these places that they call MPAs are really just an attempt to control fishing. So this suggests that there's no control outside the MPA. So in one way, we want all of the ocean to be sustainably used, and it could be called a marine protected area. In this little animation here, which is produced by the Sea Around Us project in University of British Columbia, we see the spread of fishing. In fact, this is indicated by the year that the maximum sustainable yield was reached in any part of the ocean. And I think it just shows it's, I show this to my students, they think it's some kind of pollution or disease. But actually it's the war on fish. We've been waging war on fish using industrialized methods, and now we've gone global. And it's almost like we want, as a the human race wants to catch all the fish as quickly as it can. And before this even happened, we'd already removed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of large marine mammals from the oceans. And we have no idea what impact this had on the ecosystem, because removing so many top predators must have had an effect on the food chain. More recently, people have looked at longline catches in different parts of the ocean, particularly the late Ransom Myers laboratory at Dalhousie University. So I have a couple of examples here, but there's many in the literature, and Boris Worm continues this good work there. One of the PhD students looked at the longline catches, and these sharks were a bycatch, so nobody was really reporting it. But when she compared the data over 40 years, there was actually 300 times less sharks there at that time. So massive reduction of sharks, and they were just a bycatch in this longline fishery, which was aimed at marlin and other pelagic fish. And this pattern of shark declines was happening for all the large shark species, and was happening all over the world. So this led to Boris Worm and colleagues publishing this paper showing that if we continue, they predicted by the year 2050, we would actually have almost extinction of some of these very large fish in the tropics and subtropical seas. So things aren't going very well for fisheries. Most stocks are overfished. There's declining catches. There's still subsidized, so governments are paying fishing companies to keep overfishing. It doesn't make any sense. Many say they aim to be sustainable, but I've been looking around and asking colleagues, give me an example of one fishery that's has evidence and data to show that it's sustainable. And the only one that I've got an example of so far is the Pacific halibut fishery run by the United States. And it only catches 30% of its potential catch. And the reason it catches only 30% is because you can't really predict the variation in the stock every year. So this 30% is conservative and precautionary, but it does mean that they catch exactly the same amount of fish every year. So from a business point of view, it's very reliable. And it shows that you can't really manage the fish stocks. You can only manage the fishing. And if you take a little bit less than you think is possible, then you're playing safe. You're leaving a little insurance margin. So modern fisheries, as you know, they're industrialized. Some of these nets are just incredible. You could put buses inside many of these big fishing nets. The long lines with hooks are hundreds of kilometers long. You could never imagine people on land being allowed to go hunting with such methods. We have trawls and dredges that plow up the seabed. And when these came in first in the 19th century in Europe, in the North Sea, local communities were really angry about these trawls because they said they're destroying the seabed, they're destroying the habitat, and they're destroying the fisheries. But they weren't listened to. Even the King of England actually had a law to stop this trawling, but nobody paid any attention and it continued. And now this trawling has become normalized. So people think it's normal to go trawling the seabed everywhere in the world. But there are countries like Indonesia, Chile, which are banning trawling on the seabed because it's not necessary and it's destructive. It's just a cheap way of catching fish. And I think many countries still have this naive utilitarian philosophy of dominion over nature, that if they can take it, they can take it, and that's it. They don't seem to realize or respect nature like many indigenous people do, and many people actually all over the world do. But the way the businesses and governments run seems to be more like a capitalist mentality. And the aim of most fisheries and even fisheries management is to maximize the catch because that's what the politicians want, what the fishermen want. They say it's good for the public food supply, but actually it's a little bit naive. If you maximize the catch, the chances are you're going to catch too much, at least some of the time. And then this catching too much, you're reducing your crop, as it were. And to think that people can actually manage a wild fish population on its own, I would consider it's a delusion because you have no control over the environment, the climate, the life cycle, the parasites, diseases, what food the fish have. This is in contrast to what happens when you're farming on land, where farmers do have control over these things. And we allow things in the sea that we would never allow on land. So on public land, you only and on land we only allow plowing on farmland and in gardens. Hunting and fishing is only usually allowed for selected species and it's controlled. Another interesting thing is that if you want to restore habitats in the land and sea, well, it's much easier in the sea. It's passive. It doesn't cost anything. Just stop messing things up. Whereas in land, you usually have to, it's expensive to do. You have to remove pests. You might have captive breeding programs and other efforts. And the way farmers and fishermen take control responsibility is completely different. In farming, farmers take very good care of the breeding animals. They give them the best food, the best housing, good care of them. They will pay the vet to treat them if they're ill. In fishing, we actually kill the best and oldest animals. Makes no sense, does it? The farmers take good care of juveniles. Fishing takes no care of them. They even sometimes dredge their shallow water habitats. They damage their habitat. And farmers ensure that there's plenty of food for their livestock. Whereas in fishing, often fishermen really have no idea about the food. They don't even think about the food supply. And sometimes some fishermen are fishing the fish that are the food for the other fishermen's fish. So it's a completely different mindset in the ocean than on land. And farmers have to pay for all these things. They have to pay for their broodstock, the seed, the fertilizer, the veterinary care. And when you pay for something, you really respect it because that gives it a dollar value. And they care for the land. Whereas in fishing, they get everything for free. And unfortunately, the way we humans behave is that if we get something for free, often we don't respect it. And subsidies on land are usually encouraging farmers to farm in an environmentally friendly way and protect nature. The subsidies from governments in the sea are the complete opposite. They actually subsidize people to catch more fish and destroy nature. You wonder who makes these decisions. And hunting on land and seas also has very different effects on the food webs, which I think many people don't realize. If you in the sea, we're fishing the top predators. On land, we're largely eating the plants and herbivores. And if you remove the top predators on the top of the food web, then there's a knock-on effect to the whole food chain. So you can't just remove a few large fish and lobsters or crabs or other species without having effects. In this diagram here by the late Roger Grace, another good friend of mine in New Zealand, we show what we discovered in New Zealand with marine reserves. On the left, we have a fished area with small fish, very small lobsters. And because of this, the sea urchins become bigger and abundant, and they graze all the algae and they eat the algal habitat. Whereas in an area without fishing, the sea urchin population is controlled by the top predators, and you have a rich algal habitat and much more productivity and biomass in the ecosystem overall. And in 1970, when the marine reserves were first set up in New Zealand, people thought the situation on the left of this figure was normal. And it was only more than 20 years after the reserve was established that the sea urchin population started to decrease, because they were so big that there was no predators could eat the urchins. If they get big enough, then they escape predation until they died from old age. And there was even a debate over 20 years. The scientists couldn't believe it, but now this has been shown to be the case in many countries and in many marine reserves. This experiment has been repeated. So it's an example of how having a small area, the Lee Marine Reserve is about 5 kilometers squared. It's trivial compared to what area of coast is available for fishing. But it is essentially the scientific control for the effects of fishing outside the reserve. And these are just some of the recent papers showing that this happens in Africa, North America, and the Mediterranean. So we can say that it's a general pattern, and in coral reef systems as well as kelp reef ecosystems. So if we keep going this direction, we'll see an extinction of larger animals. We're already seeing a huge loss of top predators. We're fishing down the food web, as Daniel Pauly has pointed out in his papers. There's an increase in benthic scavenging species, and we've altered the food webs and ecosystems. So at the moment, maybe we're not in a disastrous situation in the sense that we'd stop these bad practices, then things can recover. And it will be good, it'll be a win-win if we stop these bad practices in the long run, because as if we show from unprotected to protected areas here, we largely have an unprotected ocean at the moment, because 2.6% of the ocean protected is really almost nothing. And if we protect it, versus like even farmers would do on land, we'll have better food security, more reliable food, we'll have stronger fish stocks, the whole biodiversity of the system will be strengthened and more resilient to climate change and other effects. Healthier ecosystems and better livelihoods for people. So, but obviously existing fishing management is not succeeding. And not just commercial fishing impacts ecosystems. In addition to sport fishing and recreational fishing that happens now, even long ago, people have looked at historical records and they found that local communities of people thousands of years ago also had effects on some fish stocks. So we need to be conscious that we really don't have a baseline. And often when people declare a marine reserve, people think, oh, I can't do this and that there. This is terrible. This is very unusual, as if the only place you couldn't do this was in a marine reserve. But in fact, it's quite common that for areas in the ocean to be off limits to people, like military zones, industrial areas, mining, oil and gas areas, undersea cables and pipelines, where people have fish farms and marinas. So in fact, I'd love I must try and calculate this sometime, because probably if we calculated how much of the ocean are we already excluded from by commercial enterprises, it's probably much bigger than the total marine protected areas. And when people suggest a marine reserve, there's always people that object, but people always object too. If, most people would say it's good to have, hospitals and schools and museums and art galleries and sports fields. These are all good. But if you try to have one near somebody's house, they will complain. And it's the same at marine reserves. It's a public good, and it provides actually many of the same services. They provide educational, scientific, economic, social, and many other, and well-being for people. So marine reserves are actually not that unusual, really. And fishermen are not the only stakeholders in the ocean. There's also many people that would like to enjoy the ocean for maybe a small amount of food, but just to enjoy themselves and to go swimming. Perhaps one of the greatest inventions in recent decades has been the wetsuit, which keeps people floating. So it makes it much safer to take children in the water when they're wearing a wetsuit, because you know where they are and they can't sink. And there's a program in New Zealand set up by the girl in the middle of this picture, who's one of the people in an earlier photograph I showed with the people around their marine reserve. And she runs a program called Experiencing Marine Reserves. And this now takes thousands of children in New Zealand to snorkel inside and outside a marine reserve. And they have to bring one adult with them. So this is quite clever, because now you have not just the children, but the adults seeing the difference inside and outside a marine reserve. And you don't need any science. Once you see it, there's no doubt about the effectiveness of marine reserves. And another myth, especially in northern countries, which are looking for excuses, I think, not to do things, is that any country can afford to have marine reserves. Many of the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asian countries have marine reserves already, because they don't cost anything. You're stopping doing things. And there's scientists seem to have a literature about, how much does it cost to have a marine reserve? Well, if we're already managing the area for fisheries, and we must have some management costs. And if your fishery management becomes very simple, such as saying there's no fishing, well, then the cost is even simpler, because regulation is simpler. So I don't understand how people say there's increased costs. What does happen is that the cost moves from one government agency, maybe the Fisheries Department, to another government agency, the Conservation Department. So the Conservation Department now has a management cost, which the Fishery Department used to have. But if they cooperated and worked together, the overall cost to the government would be no different than before. And many of the largest MPA, all of the largest marine protected areas in the world actually, are actually hosted by Pacific Island and some Indian Ocean countries, where they've declared their entire exclusive economic zones in some areas a marine protected area. And these are small countries with indigenous people, but they do understand the value and respect the value of their ocean resources. And I must have skipped a slide. And so you wonder why would Cook Islands and small countries like this take such radical action? Well, actually, they're doing what countries promised in the United Nations Law of the Sea. They're taking responsibility for their entire exclusive economic zone and applying the precautionary principle. They're saying everything is protected unless we make an exception, whereas the opposite is happening in most other countries, where they're saying nothing is protected, do what you want, and maybe later on we'll stop you doing things if it's not working out. So again, what they're doing should be common sense everywhere. Recently, one of my students, Chen-Chur Zhao, who's now at the Ocean University in China, did a world map of biodiversity using the full range of biodiversity measures, from ecosystems to regions of endemicity, species richness, where the major marine biomes are, and seabed diversity. And he mapped out this region of the oceans here, whereas the top 30% exist. And you can see that it occurs offshore as well as inshore, and mostly is coastal, with of course the Coral Triangle and the area in Southeast Asia being the richest part of marine biodiversity in the world. So I'm suggesting here in my concluding slides that marine reserves are the only practical solution left to enable sustainable fisheries, because all of the fisheries regulations, well intended, lots of very good fishery science, but they're not working. Maybe here and there we find little examples where they're starting to work, but they really haven't tried to do the simplest thing possible, and the thing that people have known for hundreds of years. If you protect an area as a marine reserve, then that's where the broodstock and the juveniles will be safe. They will be able to grow. It provides insurance against climate and other changes that may affect stocks elsewhere. And it gives power to local communities to manage their resources. This is one of the main driving factors for having MPAs in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the Pacific Islands, is because local communities want control over their resources. And MPAs are the best way of providing that, because part of the MPA, of course, can allow certain kinds of fishing and other parts would be no fishing. And from scientists and fisheries, we now have a place where there's no fishing. So now we know what the natural populations and food webs should be like. And this provides us a reference to compare outside. So I'm asking, will more countries follow these examples? Let's hope so. They should flip management around from doing what you want to the precautionary principle. And this will benefit local communities, food security, and future generations' economic, social, and health benefits. So on that remark, I will thank you, and I'll leave some links to various pages on my website here, and please follow the Facebook/Marine Reserves page where I post news about marine reserves every day or every 2 days. Thank you very much.